Hello, everyone. This lecture is going to focus on the idea that there is no God, that God doesn't exist. So we are going to argue against a couple of the positions taken in some of the previous lectures. Now, before we get started, I just want to clarify a couple terms. Uh, First, theism, the idea of there being a God. A theist believes that a God exists, whether or not that's the Judeo-Christian God or some other God. Uh, Agnosticism is the idea that we withhold judgment about the existence of God, perhaps that we can't know whether or not God exists, or that we just don't have enough information to determine whether God exists. And then the last is atheism, which is judging that there is no God. So in this lecture, we are going to argue against the idea of theism, particularly for the Judeo-Christian God. And so before we get going, it's important to know whether or not it's even possible to prove that something doesn't exist. And this is quite problematic right from the get-go. Is it possible to prove that something like Santa Claus or unicorns or pink elephants don't exist? In order to prove that something exists, we would essentially have to show some logical contradiction in its existence, or show that we have a complete set of all things that exist, a list of all things that exist, and that thing that we're trying to claim non-existence is not on the list. And some have gone on that proving a negative is the same as proving a positive. And we can see this as being the case, but it's also quite problematic. For instance, I can prove that my wallet contains no money, just the same as I can prove that my wallet does contain money. I can have you look at my wallet and see whether or not there's money in it or whether or not there's not. I can prove that there are no gases that fail to decrease in volume when they increase in pressure without changing the temperature. In both of these instances, though, we see that there is a backdrop to what we are looking for. For instance, with the wallet, right, I have my wallet to show you whether or not I have money in it or not. It's a bit more difficult when it comes to something like God, because the backdrop is existence as a whole, and I don't have the ability to see everything that exists. Similar, if we go back to thinking of whether or not the Loch Ness Monster is real, I theoretically can drain Loch Ness and see whether or not the monster is there. How can I do that, though, with the world and the existence of God? It doesn't seem like I can, and so instead, we need to rely on simply dismantling each understanding of God individually. We need to look at arguments for the Hindu gods and find some logical contradiction, or find a logical contradiction within the Judeo-Christian God, to suggest that what's said about God or God's characteristics or attributes are problematic or inconsistent and therefore can't be real. So if we're to look at the Judeo-Christian religion, we see that there are two big problems that need to be overcome, because these two problems pose either contradiction or reason to believe that they just simply aren't true. The first is the argument for religious pluralism or inconsistent revelations, and the second, the problem of evil. When we look at the argument from religious pluralism, essentially what we're saying is that there are different cultures that all have different religions. Each of those religions is based on stories and sacred text. If each religion has a sacred text, has stories that were passed down, what makes one better or worse than another? It would seem as though if all religions are based on sacred text, then there would be nothing that makes one sacred text more sacred than another. So we should essentially just throw out all the religions, reject them all. Now, this is problematic in a number of ways, but most particularly because just because there are different sacred texts doesn't mean that one isn't necessarily right. If different cultures all have different religions, all have different texts, whether it's the the Bible or the Quran, or there are no sacred texts, just stories passed down, why can't one of those be correct? The argument from religious pluralism essentially throws the baby out with the bathwater, suggesting because we have no reasons to believe any, we should just dismiss them all. But this, of course, is problematic because one of them could be true, and we're not sure. We can also look at the idea that certain texts or religious scriptures are better than others, are more correct than others. For instance, if we were to look at Christianity, we can see that there are aspects of the Bible that are fairly accurate historically, archaeologically, and we can see that there are aspects within the Bible that are true. Now, comparing that to the Church of Trek, which is essentially a church that was made up on the TV cartoon Futurama, where people believed that uh, Star Trek was their religion. If we were to look back at the historically accurate or archaeologically accurate aspects of Star Trek, we would see that there are none. It was a fiction story created in the late 1900s about space travel, of which none of the characters are historic people. And so when we look back, we can see, well, one of these actually has corroborating evidence through historical texts. One of them does not. One of them talks about real places, such as Bethlehem and Jerusalem. One of them talks about odd planets and species of people that don't seem to exist. So here we might be inclined to say, well, Christianity is probably more correct than the Church of Trek. But of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity is correct. But it does go to show that our argument from religious pluralism is somewhat problematic. The more popular and common problem for the Judeo-Christian religion is the problem of evil, and that suffering is incompatible with the characteristics of God. For instance, there are three main characteristics of God, such that he is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. He is all-knowing, he is all-powerful, and he is all-good. If God is all-knowing, then he would know that evil occurs in the world. If he was all-powerful, he would be able to do something about the evil that happens in the world. And if he were good, he would want to do something about the evil in the world. And yet there is still evil. Atheists and those trying to dismantle the Judeo-Christian religion would think of this as a contradiction within the text and stories, within the understanding of God, and suggest that because suffering is incompatible, God must not exist as Judeo-Christians claim he does. Now, theists have latched onto this argument and have come up with objections for the problem of evil, suggesting that suffering is somehow essential to God's greater plan, that our suffering is a test, and that we don't need to know or can't know why God does things. But not knowing why we suffer doesn't mean that God lacks a good reason for it, only that we just don't understand it. This, of course, is in itself problematic because there's no basis or reason for this to be the case. This can simply be an out for any problem that exists with an understanding of God. It could be a problem with purpose. What is the purpose of humans? Well, we don't need to know, and it doesn't matter that we can't know. God may still have a reason. But being good philosophers, we want to make claims and arguments that are proven through argumentation. And the argumentation required for this objection is that, first of all, God exists, therefore, God can have a greater plan. But the argument in question is whether God exists. So here we're seeing the theists make a circular argument in that they are using God's existence as a premise for evil existing, when what is in question is that premise that God exists in the first place. Other theists might make the claim that the reason that there is suffering in the world is not because of God, but because of people's free will. It is not God's fault that people do evil things because people were given free will by God. This accounts for the moral evils of the world. People commit heinous crimes such as rape and murder because they are allowed to be free. Our flaws are essentially not God's problem, they are a problem with our own. Free will is a gift that unfortunately comes with this problem of evil. But there are problems with the free will. First being, why couldn't God create a world in which we are free to do as we want, but just not have certain evil desires? For instance, I don't go around on a daily basis thinking about stealing things. While I'm free to steal things, it's not my desire to do that. If it's not my desire, am I really free to steal something? Perhaps God could make us have freedom to murder, but just not include that desire with people. Again, I don't go around thinking of how to murder people constantly. Does that mean I don't have the free will to do it? Also, what's so great about free will? Why can't God just take away certain aspects that seem to have no purpose, like murder? Am I any less free if I can't murder somebody or never have the desire to murder somebody? I mean, I'm still free to choose and believe whether or not God exists. So I may think of myself now, sitting here thinking that I have the freedom to choose whether or not God exists, regardless of whether or not I desire to murder somebody or not. So couldn't God just remove certain parts of our desires or choosing? Another problem with this free will defense is that it only accounts for moral evils. If evil exists because people are free to do evil things, such as rape and murder, commit theft and arson, how does that account for natural evils in the world, such as hurricanes and earthquakes, that also cause suffering and death? Natural evils are not evils that can be explained away by free will. And so free will doesn't actually overcome the problem of evil. It just pushes it back to natural evils. So now we have to understand why it is that God creates hurricanes and earthquakes and allows suffering from these types of things to occur. If he were able to stop it, if he were to know when they would occur, and if he would want to be able to stop it because he's good. The only real objection would go back to the idea that there is some plan of God's or some reason that God has for these natural evils to occur. So that a world with hurricanes and earthquakes is a better world than a world without hurricanes and earthquakes. So that we would think essentially, or would need to think, that there is some greater plan or greater good that's served by having these. But once again, that idea presupposes that God even exists in the first place. And as philosophers, we want to know for certain whether or not things are true or false, whether they exist or don't exist. And so I want to know whether or not God exists. I want to know whether or not that God has a plan for things. I can't just assume, well, God has a plan, so that squashes the problem of evil. Because you haven't proven that God does have a plan. The theist isn't able to guarantee God's plan. And so, philosophically, we can't hold that position with any amount of certainty. And so, the atheists can attack the theist's position and once again place the burden of proof on the theist to suggest that God must exist and that the theist must account for seemingly contradictory attributes or characteristics of the God that they are attempting to claim exists.